We have a fantastic panel for the next session, and in the next few minutes you can see how well they hold a brief, because I'll tell you the question they were asked to think about, and they were given between 3 and no more than 5 minutes to give their thoughts on this question. So the question they were asked to consider was, to be realists we must first be visionaries. What is the vision for the arts beyond the cuts? And I will introduce them in turn as they answer that question. They'll speak for 3 to 5 minutes. We'll have about 10 minutes just for you, not in a structured way as before, but just to talk to each other, carry on that conversation, then we'll bring you back in, we'll knock it around with a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll break for coffee. So our first speaker is Deborah Bull, who's Creative Director of the Royal Opera House. Deborah.
Thank you. The last time I was asked to speak on this subject in Brighton, I was accused of being an optimist. And I think I should say here, I'm neither an optimist nor what I call a pestinist, which is those people who spent far too long listening to Robert Peston. But I do think I'm a pragmatist and a bit of an idealist. So in line with that, I want to start by talking about opportunity, because I really believe in every crisis there is an opportunity. And all the research shows that periods of financial challenge are the times when the most significant changes take place in the marketplace and in consumer behavior. And I think for arts organizations, this is really an unprecedented opportunity for us to reconnect with our audiences, to challenge prevailing assumptions, both globally and within our own organizations, about who those audiences are and what they want, and to gain a deeper and more complete understanding of our audiences, because that's going to be key to shaping the vision for the future. The other point about financial challenge is it forces us to restate and protect our core values. They not only articulate who we are, but they should determine what we do. And I think in good times, all organizations, for the best reasons, accrue activity which is not core. It may indeed be extremely treasured, but economic necessity forces you to, what I call, hack off the barnacles and be clear about what your strategic purpose is. And I think that renewed sense of purpose, allied to a greater understanding of audiences, is really an opportunity that we shouldn't ignore at this point. But there is, of course, challenge, and I think if we're going to maximize investment into new ideas and audiences, then we are going to need to imagine and pursue new ways of working together to stretch the available resources and to lever additional support. We talk a lot about partnerships, but for me the word partnership doesn't go nearly far enough. I think we need to create somebody said alliance earlier, I call it a network of mutually supportive organizations which connect on multiple dimensions and in many directions, each with absolute clarity about their individual purpose and their distinctiveness, but with a shared commitment to developing our audiences, artists, pathways for progression, and exploring innovative ideas and formats. And I think developing that network requires us to put audiences and artists at the heart of what we do, and that may mean putting our own organizational success, something that we used to cherish, further in the background. We need to recognize that we will all bring different strengths to this joint endeavor. Smaller organizations who are less well established, they have less long-term security perhaps, but at the same time fewer of the associated constraints. So they may be in a position to be a little more fleet of foot, a little more flexible, a little more able to bring culturally responsive or even maverick ideas to life. Those larger scale organizations, the longer established ones, they have the scale, they may have the resources, they may have the track record in raising funds, and crucially they've got the brand power to persuade audiences to go with them on a creative journey. But they do have to plan longer term, and that can reduce their ability to be flexible and responsive. So of course that presents a conundrum. And many organizations outside the arts have found different ways to resolve that. Some outsource their innovation, but I don't believe this is right, because I think outsourcing innovation divorces it from the culture of your organization, and actually organizational culture as well as what we do may need to change. I think we'll all benefit if we can develop these symbiotic relationships where large and small organizations work together to develop new ideas and new audiences. And at the Opera House, through RH2, that's very much the core of what we've tried to do, to allow new ways of thinking to rub off on the organisation whilst protecting the creative risk takers for some of the more tedious constraints and accountabilities of a large-scale organisation. So my vision for the arts sees us all building on this notion of an interconnected, non-competitive network of organisations, creating a framework through which skills, expertise, know-how, resources, networks, new ideas and approaches can be shared back and forth across the sector. And it will depend on a degree of trust and willingness to collaborate from organisations who might in the past have seen themselves as competitors, a sort of open source innovation which we hear talked about within technology. My final thought, I'm not looking at the clock, is that in all of this we mustn't forget that the arts are not the only area of life which are subject to severe cuts. Across all areas of our public and private life we're going to feel the impact of economic challenge, with services and jobs reducing and in some places disappearing, and tensions, factions, dissatisfaction on the increase. The arts have always had a vital role to play in allowing us to understand other cultures, other communities, other value systems and other ways of thinking. They let us communicate across barriers of education, class, language, ethnicity, cultures, and to gain an understanding and therefore a tolerance of other people and how they live their lives. And at this moment in time, that really couldn't be more important. Just one example of this at work. In December last year, the Opera House staged an opera and its new production facility in Thurrock in the Thames Gateway. It was created over a year and a half with 1,000 people from the local community, children, young teens, people in their late 80s, people who've lived in Thurrock for generations, newcomers to the area, people with learning disabilities working alongside their neighbours to create the costumes, the props, the sets, the storyline, and to write the music, and then with a professional director and composer to weave that into an extraordinary piece. In performance, in this building, the orchestra of the Royal Opera House performed with a cast of professionals and community participants, with a crew made up of Royal Opera House technicians and local people who were learning new skills. That building will go on to create local employment and training opportunities. It is the intrinsic artistic excellence of the Royal Opera House, allied to a genuine commitment to participation and access, which allowed that extrinsic value to be created. There is a kind of virtuous circle, which means these two things are indeed one. The creation and the performance of that unique piece of work enabled an entire community to find its voice and to express itself through creativity, and to tell out loud what it believes in and what it holds dear. And I don't know if that's the big society, but if it isn't, then I'm not sure what is.
Thank you. And our second respondent to the question that we have posed, to be realists, we must first be visionaries. What is the vision for the arts beyond the cuts? Is the writer and broadcaster Ekow Eshun. Ekow.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Very glad to be here. I sometimes think that we can make a mistake in debates like this by thinking that some or the chief amount of answers to how we create a more ambitious sector and so on lie externally, lie with questions of funding or philanthropy or, different models of business. I tend to think that equally important are the questions that we can ask ourselves about how we organise ourselves as organisations and as institutions. And I guess that's to say that one of the things I'm keenly aware of is how much things are changing around us. How fast social change is happening, how fast cultural change is happening, how fast technological change is happening. As we speak, there are revolutions taking place in the world, large ones and small ones. But one of the things I'm very aware of is that demographically, the arts hasn't, over the last decade or so, despite all sorts of efforts, demographically, the arts isn't speaking to a larger or more socially diverse set of the population. We've been speaking to the same people for years and years and years. And that's to say that we're not connecting with some of the ways that the world around us is changing. We're missing an opportunity. And I think part of that comes from the ways that we organise and structure ourselves as institutions. It's easy sometimes to focus on technology and say that the answer to this is just to create a new website. Technology is important because social media, in fact, does allow us an opportunity to have profound conversations and ongoing conversations. But it's only a part of the thing. The real issue is how we match this divide. And let me give you an example in terms of what I'm thinking of. There was actually a good pamphlet written last year by John Holden at Demos about changes at the RSC, about how the RSC was facing a set of really difficult challenges at the end of the... There are probably people from the RSC here, aren't they? Facing a difficult set of challenges at the end of the start of the millennium, and how they realised that those changes were internal ones, but were also to do with the fact that the public wanted something more and something different from its institutions. They wanted institutions that were more open, that were more porous, that were less siloed. And that's not... And the answer to how we express a relevance and a meaning for our place as arts organisations in the world has to lie with how we can reorganise ourselves to make best use of that. I'm possibly not being that clear, but I guess what I'd say fundamentally is that we can't just carry on as normal and think about how we communicate in different ways. We have to also acknowledge that we, as institutions, as organisations, as arts professionals, have to re-understand, have to re-change the ways we work together. And so that means, yes, more collaboration across institutions, but it also means opening up institutions themselves. It also means being less siloed. It also means holding on to professional practice, but acknowledging that inside any single place we can learn from each other much more fluidly, much more openly than we have done. Because if we don't do that, what are we? We become cathedrals of culture. We become places that sit on a hill. We become places that are vertical rather than potentially horizontal. I think there's an enormous opportunity for all of us right now to take part in a profound conversation with the public about the value of the arts. And we can do that in ways that are daily, in ways that are constant. We can use social media to do that. But we have to have the will, and we have to have the purpose in place to do that. We have to be organisations that are more open. We have to be organisations that are more questioning of ourselves and the world around us, because actually that's what the world looks like right now. There's a tremendous opportunity because the world right now is full of people who are more questioning, who are more hungry, who are more desiring of change, who are more desiring of information and ideas than ever before. I think our place and our potential into the future lies in a constant engagement with people in those terms, and lies in a constant challenge to ourselves to how we can ask questions of ourselves internally, to be better, to be more open, to be more fluid, to be more possible and more potential into the future. Thank you.
In keeping with my habit of springing nasty surprises on people, because, Ed, you've been nodding so much as you've been listening, what I'm going to ask you to do at the end of these four contributions is to pull out what you see as kind of being key strands of what you've heard before we open up to the rest of them. And then I might ask the other people to come back and see whether they agree with your summary of their key strands. OK, so our third speaker is Sandy Nairne, who's director of the National Portrait Gallery. Sandy.
Thank you. I'd reverse our question. To be realists, we must be visionaries. To have any chance of being visionaries, we must be realists. We're tacticians, we're collagists, we're bricoleurs, we're mercenaries and entrepreneurs of cultural resources. We stitch and we weave. We all know that. Secondly, we have to understand where we are, and I think I have to pick up a couple of Ed's points. We need to keep distinguishing lottery from granting aid. They are very, very different things. We need to be clear that the resources released by the Treasury for museums are not Treasury resources. These are the reserves that museums themselves have earned. The regional museums have principal and core funding from local authorities. They have wonderful and crucial Renaissance funding as development funds alongside. It is not, I'm afraid, Ed, as you put it, that is the core funding. We need to be clear about where we are. In terms of where we're going, I would make great praise for the elegant U-turn. We've seen U-turns on school sports. We've seen U-turns on forests. We need selective U-turns. We need it on cultural education. We need it on tuition fees. We need it on heritage. And we need it on investment in the arts. Lastly, lastly, and it reinforces very much what Deborah and Ekow have been saying, it's both artists and audiences in the lead that we want to see in that relationship between the realist and the visionary. It's the trusting and offering resources to the cosmopolitan, to the diverse, to the innovative, supporting brilliant creative work across the country. I stood 2 weeks ago with our founding portrait, the great portrait, the Chandos portrait of Shakespeare in Sunderland. That portrait belongs to Sunderland as much as it belongs to any other part of the country. It isn't in Sunderland all the time, but when it's there now, it's a fantastic moment of knowing that partnership makes that possible. There's no way in which the Portrait Gallery can do that without Tyne and Wear Museum Service and all of the resources and all of the people there that make that possible, and the excitement around that kind of sharing. We all know that leads us to what we know with both audiences and artists, which is an inspired pragmatism. That's certainly the way forward. Thank you.
And then finally, before I turn to Ed, Phil Redmond.
Well, I think I can get off now because Sandy's just said it all, you know. Were you looking at my notes? You cheat. Incidentally, the examiners will be looking for a bit of creativity, you know, and a little bit of artistic license in the answer to the questions. But actually, the real, it's a multiple choice answer, really. You know, if you say, what should we do? What's the one thing we should do over the next year? If you say survive, you'll get 10 points for that, because you're being pessimistic. You know, if you say listen, which I think is the point Ekow was actually making, you'll get 15 points for that. You know, because at least you're starting to become, you know, part of the community. But if you say become self-aware and honest about what we actually do, then you'll get the full 20 points. Because I think that really is the big challenge, and this is what is behind what Sandy's saying. And I like to think about hows, you know, rather than what's, because we've all spent a lot of time coming into these rooms and having these group therapy sessions, don't we? You know, and then we all go home, and then 2 days later, as I always say, we, you know, we go back, we reset to default, don't we? It's actually that's a sort of high geeky term, you know. And the big challenge at the moment is just that we just need to shift the words around in the title. You know, realist must come before visionary. You've got to understand the environment that you're operating in, and you've got to understand things like the technology, and you've got to understand where the cash is coming from. And coming from a city of philosophers, you know, I mean, John Lennon would probably come out and say, "The dream is over. What more can I say?" You know, Mecca would come on and pick up his acoustic and give you a good rendition of Yesterday. Ringo would turn up and say, "Hey man, please, shit happens." But George actually would put it much better when he says all things must pass, because that seems to imply that, you know, we are in a cycle, we're going to move forward from here. And I have to say to you, we have been here before. And it's like sort of all our yesterdays to me. I don't know when I'm reaching that age now, when I'm sort of starting to lose years, you know. But I suddenly find myself in a city taking on, you know, or theoretically thinking they're taking on a Tory government, you know. You know, and it's actually quite nice, actually, because on here I'm sort of stage right, but out there to you, I am camera far left, aren't I? But the big thing is, like, how do we do it? How do we move forward, you know? And underneath this thing about art is good, it's fantastic, it's great, it's empowering, it does all this kind of thing. There is the question is, like, whose art, you know, art for who, and access. Because we're getting to a point now when we're, you know, considering the things like the museums, what level of grants we've got. And to be honest, we're all right, right? I mean, there's a lot of knee-jerking and there's a lot of trauma because it never was, it's not like it used to be. Right? But actually, we've still got a 20 million quid of public money being sent up quite regularly. You know? And we've also got some of the finest collections in the world. And we're now sort of going into the cupboards and looking under the stairs and thinking that we might actually put the 50 Turners that we've got out on display. Why not? It's a radical idea, isn't it? Yeah. We got the mayor Ivory collection, one of the finest Mayer collections in the world. We've got about 15% out, but it's not all in one place, it's scattered around the gallery. So why don't we loan it to the V&A with a little badge that says, this is actually a National Museum of Liverpool, one of the finest museum services in the world, which it is. And that's why the last time Liverpool was having a fight with the Tories nationalised the museums to actually stop militants flogging it off. Like going into the cupboard saying, here's a tenner. What do you reckon, Joe? 50, 35, 40? We do that. We do 200 houses with that. Whack it on eBay. We didn't have eBay then, of course, however. That's more geeky stuff, by the way. But there's a kind of also a metaphor, is that there's the tension, because art who's art. If you retreat too far back to just protecting the collections, you're getting back to art for the toffs. But the problem is, it's the people who pay. It's the taxpayer that pay. It's the taxpayer that owns all these collections. They need to see them. They need better access to them. And so one of the things we need to think about is keeping things like free admission. And that's not, again, old hippie, huggy stuff. It's pure economics. National Museums Liverpool has nearly 3 million people coming through the door. We've now seen in the last quarter our winter figures are even higher than 2008. First indications that people are choosing to come to the free admission venues as they sort of start to deal with the kind of fiscal crisis. That's good, isn't it? That's good social stuff. But in 2008, we proved for every pound spent on culture brings £6 back into the local economy. The National Museums, 20 million, say, brings in 120 million into Liverpool's local economy. And while the people are with us, they're not up to mischief anywhere else. And they're not creating other things. They're not out getting them ASBOs. I think CBOs now, rather than ASBOs. But they're not out pulling down cost from other social services. We've now set up the Institute of Cultural Capital to start providing the evidential data for that. And so the investment in the culture, the investment in the arts, is actually one of the most cost-effective ways that government can invest in all our social services. And that's something else we need to do. We need to start moving away from the silos. We need to be talking to education, to health, to police, to fire and rescue, transport, about what a fully integrated cultural city should actually be. And we're doing that up in the People's Republic. Do you notice we've got an embassy in London now? It's a second sign that we are finally at last beginning to recognise the United Kingdom. I'm not sure it'll ever happen, but But just to, I could go on forever, that, I'm a Scouse. But how do we do it? Well, here's a radical idea. Ed said that he supports the idea of devolving to local authorities. Inspirational, that is. They're the ones who are actually sort of looking first at their culture budgets to make all the cuts. Wirral tried to shut down the libraries 2 years ago until Frank Cottrell-Boyce stopped them. So is really that the best way to think about where cultural funds should go? So here's a radical idea, Ed. Let's make up some policy. We've got local enterprise boards, or local enterprise partnerships. Why don't we have local cultural partnerships? And, so we can set up a board that will actually ask government directly for the funds for the arts and culture, and work with the community, and make every single pound do that, work 6 times, make it harder. And it is possible, this, because under the localism bill that's going through Parliament now, everybody has the right to ask a local authority for the right to run the service if they think they can do it better. Right? And it's going actually through the localism bill. So here, Ed, is my application. Dear Ed, can I please apply to run the Arts, Culture and Library Service currently managed by Liverpool City Council under the expression of interest provision in the new localism bill when enacted?
Thanks for that, Phil. I thought when you were talking about what great figures from Liverpool would have said, you might have added Kenny Dalglish, who might have said that the challenge is to turn your greatest asset into an income stream, and the importance of mission and leadership to changing your performance. I'm just saying that to check my view, which is the people in the arts sector don't understand anything about sport. I've just proven that. Ed, do you want to respond to some things there?
Well, thanks very much. I'll start on the far right with Phil Redmond. I think one of the reasons that Liverpool has set up an embassy in London is that so when Phil comes to London, he can claim diplomatic immunity. Phil and I are very, very close. I sometimes feel we were separated at birth. Obviously, I grew up with Grange Hill. And that's one of the reasons why I, too, have had the thought about local cultural partnerships. I think there's certainly the germ of a policy idea there. And funny enough, it's something that I discussed when I sat down with Manchester City Council the other day, and I certainly think it's something we're going to explore. And I also think that there's no reason why you couldn't ask different organisations to run culture in a local area. In the Henley Review, there's an option for music services for different for arts organisations potentially to run the local authority music service. And I certainly think that an element of people, an element of choice, or people saying, actually, we think we could do this better, would really be fantastic. Sandy, on my right, just about, I take issue with pretty much everything he said. I think the reason we've had a renaissance in the arts is because of the lottery. I don't think you can, there are obviously different funding streams and they do different jobs, but I don't think you can, I think it is wrong to talk simply about the cuts in grant and aid and not acknowledge the increase in lottery funds. The Arts Council lottery funds support things like grants for the arts, youth music and other important artistic innovations. I think they built your restaurant, Sandy, which again provides an income stream for your museum. And it's also incredibly galling when you fight very hard for 6 months to get museum reserves, which is something that we couldn't get under the last government and which national museums have trooped in to complain about to me when I was in opposition, and we fought incredibly hard with the Treasury, which, as you know, has a extremely bizarre view of the world, which regards other people's money as its own. I thought we achieved a great victory there, and I think it will make a difference. The reason that I nodded so vigorously when I was hearing Deborah and Ekow talk was because I thought their remarks really genuinely took the debate forward. I'd like nothing more, as I said at the Select Committee, than to write a blank cheque for the arts. I'm a person who, in some respects, quite likes quiet life, and if I could write a big cheque and then potentially take the applause, that would be very easy. But as I said, we can't get away from the fact that we are in the economic situation we are. And I think both Deborah and Ekow, and I hope I'm not praying you in aid unfairly, recognise that even in a difficult situation, there are still opportunities. And I think in particular when Ekow was talking about how the arts should look at themselves, I thought that was a very powerful message, because it is frustrating that, and I'm the minister, so obviously these are the conversations I have, but there is a dialogue between government and the arts, which is simply, what can you do for us? And the dialogue has to go much wider, and that was what I was trying to get across, perhaps unsuccessfully in my speech, which is there are huge opportunities out there in terms of partnerships, alliances, working together, and thinking creatively. And I take Ekow's point about, so I'm beginning to ramble a bit like Phil here. I'm coming back to Phil at the end. I take Ekow's point about technology not being the only thing. That the reason I talk a lot about technology is I see it, first of all, as important, because I do think a lot of the social changes we see are driven by technology, but I also, to a certain extent, see it as a metaphor, as the way in which society is changing, and that the arts should be absolutely at the heart of that change rather than sitting on the sidelines. And when we talk about access and bit porous and horizontal organisations, I completely agree with that. And I think one of the ways you do it is potentially through technology. And I've forgotten now the point I was going to come back to. Phil Redmond. But of course, one way to get your turners out is to digitise them and then invite the people of Liverpool to curate your national museums, which I think would be fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed. Okay, so you've got about 10, 15 minutes I'm not giving you a particular task. I just want you to talk on your table about what you've heard, what you think is interesting, and then we'll take some points and we'll bring the panel in at the end before we break for coffee in about half an hour's time. So get talking. Stop talking, that's absolutely brilliant. Okay, so I'm not going to pick on people anymore. I'm going to ask you to put your hand up in the air and say, here's a fantastic point we've just discussed at our table, something we want to share with the panel, or something we want to challenge that we've heard, or perhaps I should go back to picking on people. Oh dear. Sorry. Right, fantastic. Here comes the mic.
I just wanted to say I was really, really pleased we've been discussing...
Tell us who you are,
sorry, Judith Knight, Director of Arts Admin, producing organisation in London. We've been discussing communication again here, which is absolutely accepted that we need to get ourselves better communicated to the population of the country, but I still feel that we are beating ourselves up enormously. I was very pleased to hear Nick Sirota and Phil Redmond say that, because... Just for Deborah Bull and Ekow...
He's got more hair than I've got.
I'm so sorry. I'm over. I'm so sorry. Excuse me,
We're
Sandy.
all so glad it wasn't us that said it.
Indeed. Indeed. I'm so sorry,
given us all a
Sandy.
lift,
Apologies. Just for Deborah Bull and Ekow Eshun, we are communicating. We are resilient. We are innovative. We do collaborate. We do those things already. We're not perfect. But I think the message, as Ed Vaizey is in the room, needs to be made that those things are already happening. We subsidise the arts, not all of us and everybody working the arts by long hours, by low pay, and actually we are as imaginative as it possibly we can. And I think if we just forever go back and say, okay, we'll manage on less money, we'll try and cope because we do already, then we're sending a very dangerous message to government. We need to be angry, politely angry, and say this has got to be a change, we've got to have a U-turn, and thank heavens that the right person, Nick Sirota, said, sorry, my brain, Sandy Nairne, it's because I've written you down in the wrong name. Anyway, apologies for that, Sandy, but thank you for saying that, and I really would like Ed Vaizey to hear that message from us.
Okay. I kind of take that as never forget the word even in the sentence could do better, so could do even better. Yeah. Okay. Penny.
Hello, I'm Penny Egan. I'm the chair of the Jeffrey Museum, but I also used to, before Matthew, I was Matthew's predecessor at the RSA, and I kind of wanted to refer back to some of the work we did in the 90s at the RSA and pick up on the point about the cultural education project that Ed has mentioned. Because one of the things that, there's a lot of interesting, life has moved on. There's a lot of interesting analysis of how the local management of schools and the national curriculum kind of clashed at that stage, and what the ramifications for that was. And I'm not saying life is the same, but there's an interesting body of work that kind of is sitting there, and it might be worth exploring that. But really what I wanted to say is, how is that the Henley new cultural education report going to link into the Gove national curriculum project?
Okay, thank you. And then I'll take the gentleman in the green jumper.
I'm coming.
This is a tip for future years. If you want to be called, wear a bright colour.
I'm the very green Rick Hall from Ignite. The question really is, we've spoken a lot about the economics of it all, and it's a very simple question, really, to the Minister. Do you accept Phil's economic comment that £1 invested brings £6 back to the economy? And if so, why cut?
I think Ed's been very game. He's made a speech. He's answered one lot of questions. Now you're picking on him again. So can we have questions that are for the whole panel, not just the believers?
Can I briefly, because I probably should come off the panel. The reason I wanted to stay this morning was to actually hear what other people had to say. But then I got stuck on the panel, which is great to be here with Nick Sirota and...
with Jeremy Hunt,
exactly, You can ask you can make the points you want about funding, all you like. As I said to the Select Committee, I'd love to give the arts a blank cheque. We fought incredibly hard for arts funding. But we are where we are, and I think we've got a very good deal. You can waste a tremendous amount of energy saying that we should reverse the cuts, or you can look realistically at what is there. I think that, the Labour spokesman's here this afternoon. You can ask them if Labour will reverse the cuts. In terms of £1 for £6, there's analysis like that for the arts, there's analysis like that for almost every sector that lobbies government for money. That's something that people twigged onto about 15 years ago, and now PwC and other organisations make a tremendous amount of money producing those kind of reports, and that's fantastic. What I think this conference should be about is about how the arts move forward, what the opportunities are, how the landscape is changing rapidly, and how the arts should be at the centre of that. And that's why I gravitate towards the left rather than the right. Because I think those are the exciting things that we should be discussing. There's a room full of creative people. And I have said that the arts, by the way, I've said it many times, that the arts are subsidised by the people who work in them, just as much as they are by a government grant and aid. But what are the fantastic opportunities that exist, given the enormous range of organisations represented in this room?
Right. I just want to, in case you ever worry about Ed's veracity, I want to confirm, I used to work in government, and whenever I met anybody, you had to go through two arguments. One was, as you say, the consultant's report that showed for every pound spent in that sector, £150 was saved, and the other was a dodgy bit of opinion poll research that showed that 98% of the public didn't want any cuts in that particular sector. Okay, so points not just for Ed, is that right? Fine, okay.
Here.
Hello, Joanna Foster, Chair of the Crafts Council. In the earlier discussion and in the keynote speeches, they were very centred on the UK. And I'd be very interested to know, in the discussion we've had about alliances and partnerships, how anybody feels we're situated with alliances, etc., for internationally, because certainly from the contemporary craft point of view, we are hugely admired for what goes on in this country. And the alliances and the international galleries that come to shows and things are very remarkable. So I'd like to have a bit of international comment from the panel, please.
Great point. And then there's a gentleman there in a white shirt.
Marcus Davey, the Roundhouse. We were talking about realism before vision, which was a comment I think one of the panel made.
Nick Sirota.
Nick Sirota. And Sandy, thank you.
That joke's finished now.
I was just wondering if the panel member could just outline a project they thought was a great project that started with realism before a vision.
Okay, all right. And then there's a lady there. We'll take three more and then we'll bring the panel back.
Hi, I'm Belinda Kidd, Chief Executive of Bath Festivals, and previously spent a wonderful 3 years working in Liverpool for the Liverpool Arts Generation Consortium. And I wanted to ask the panel to reflect on what's involved in collectivism and collaboration. One of the interesting things about going to Liverpool and working for that consortium was watching how people had to leave their ego at the door and to work together. And I think that the ways of working collaboratively don't always come easily in the arts. Where I've moved to in Bath, I can see there's a cultural forum. We're trying to learn how to work together, but it's not easy. And we talk about it easily, but I think we need to spend some time thinking about what's really involved.
Great. And then there's a lady over there. In fact, there's two people in kind of parallel lines, so I'll take them both, much to the annoyance of all the people who've been trying to get my attention here.
Hi, my name's Karen Fryer. I'm Managing Director of New Deal of the Mind. I just wanted to build upon what Deborah was talking about this whole concept of sleight of foot or fleet about the smaller organisations. I think we all recognise that the funding is limited, but we work with a number of partners inside of London and nationally as well, some that are large, some that are small. And I think that in 5 years' time, we all know that the Royal Opera Houses of this world are going to survive. They have large fundraising departments, development groups that can continue to go after private benefactors and the private sector as well. My concern is about the smaller arts organisations out there who have to basically be a jack of all trades, and they don't have that resource behind them. They don't have the brand name behind them. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to perhaps sort of revisit the way in which we divide that pot of gold that is available under the current climate. Because I'm concerned that the smaller arts organisations that don't have the brand name and don't have the fundraising resources out there will just die.
Thank you. Panel, just so you know, because I'm going to bring you in a second, I'm just going to ask you to pick 2 points that you want to respond to. Don't try and respond to everything, you've only got 2 minutes. Okay.
Hello, I'm Ghislaine Boddington from Body Data Space, and I just wanted to back up Judith's point and link to Deborah to say many, many small organisations have been working, as Deborah described so beautifully, for a long time, and I think maybe we need to acknowledge that within this grouping. But also with the technology side. So my question was more linked into internationalism again, and actually whether we can discuss some kinds of new models of co-production using technologies, local-to-local connectivities, and the dynamics you're talking about, which actually lead towards employability situations for artists. So bringing in the independent artists and how we deal with employability and mobility within a European and an international scene. Because I think we are going to be very reliant on that, and we need to use those possible partnerships that are out there for our artists, not just for the artists that are already working between countries in Europe very easily.
Okay. Phil, 2 minutes, 2 points.
2 minutes, I'll leave my ego at the door then. International, National Museum of Liverpool, 10% of its visitors are international. They come specifically to the city to actually see the collection. That's the main reason they come there. That's worth 20 million to the local economy. The point about all this money thing, I'm going to help my twin brother out here. The point about 1 to 6 is not that it should all be government funding. The thing is that the local cultural partnership should be finding ways to actually bring the money out of the business sector into the cultural arts sector and then put it straight back into the cultural sector. But government's role is actually to try and help us facilitate that. That's what it's about. And that's where we're taking the George Harrison view, not the Lennon or the McCartney view of yesterday. We're on George Harrison, all things must pass. What's the new model for the future?
Just to follow on from that, my first is very much about incentives. I'm very, very ready to move forward. I'm certainly not looking back. But I think, Ed, put it this way round, I think we all want to work with you on how do we get the Treasury to really help, you've spoken about this, improve gift aid, really get some of those incentives working. And I think nobody here differs on saying that will make a difference. It's the point for smaller, larger, all organisations and individuals to make a difference. And I think if we can all work on what will be very practical schemes with the Treasury to get them to take that new view, that really will make a difference and certainly will move things forward. Secondly, the practical to the visionary, there were those working in our collections team who spend their time thinking about how the collections could be used better and more. One of them was working in our rights and images department, thinking about photographs and images we weren't using, invented the idea of an exhibition called Gay Icons. It became a huge success. Something that we then found was not only a success with a wide range of people, but also something beyond that in terms of talking about rights, talking about understanding, talking about freedoms. And then we found ourselves in a conversation with the new Museum of Human Rights in Canada, thinking about how they could pick up what had happened in Gay Icons. And I think that kind of connectivity, we know, can work internationally and well beyond. Thank you.
I think just one point, just about realism and vision. Just had one example which may or may not be that accurate, but it's the first thing that came to my mind, which is when Tate Modern opened in 2000, Nick Serota had an interesting choice about how you hang the work in there. So they, realistically speaking, their collection is not the greatest contemporary art collection in the world. It's good, but it's not the greatest. And so they made a choice to hang the work non-chronologically, to hang the work thematically across rooms. It was at that time, it was a bold decision. In fact, it was a hugely influential decision. Some years later, MoMA reopened and they rehung in the same way. But the point that struck me about that was that it was a pragmatic decision, but also it was about how you open up the space. It's about how you move away from creating a space that, in Tate's case, was potentially chronological, potentially about saying there's only one way to read art and to read history, and how you offer an alternative that becomes more open, that becomes about possibilities and becomes about new connections and new themes across art. I think it set a tone for for Tate Modern in principle as a whole. I think it set the tone for Tate Modern as a place that's more open and that's become one of the most significant visitor attractions in Britain today, and it set a tone internationally for how Britain can lead the way in new ways of understanding and opening up access and engagement with contemporary art and culture. So that's what I think about.
Great. Deborah.
I'll start with Marcus' realism vision point. I think it's not one or the other. I think the two have to go hand in hand, because we all know that great organisations and great ideas usually come from visionaries, but they land and take root because they're relevant to the time in which the time or the community or the place in which they're offered. So I think being the realism is actually very much linked to the vision for me. And then the sort of pot of gold, Karen made a point about pot of gold and dividing it differently. That's a question for the Arts Council. I'm not going to sit here and say great. But I think we should be realistic about what organisations which are able to raise money or which are perceived as well-funded can do in partnership with small organisations. And I think that's a way that the pot of gold gets spread around and is made to work harder. So I would absolutely be behind that. And if I may, I think whenever you talk to a room full of 400 people, some comments are going to be relevant to some organisations and not to others. And I wasn't suggesting that nobody collaborates. I was suggesting that as a sector we could learn from those people who do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're coming to the end of this session. I think I remember reading some neuroscience research that says that when people are really, really focusing on something and thinking really hard about it, they're actually slightly more likely to make slips of the tongue or malapropisms. So far, I've been referred to as Laurie. Sandy's been referred to as Nick Sorocha, and someone over there referred to sleight of foot, which is a new concept for me. So clearly you are focusing incredibly hard. You've got a break now between 11:20 and 12, but it's not really a break because you're going to carry on talking to each other, and we've got the Flash conference going on as well. So continue to keep the momentum before you move to your next sessions at 12 o'clock. But can I ask you to join me in thanking Deborah, Ekow, Sandy, Phil and Ed?